Good afternoon, class. We're here to discuss today the educational theory of theorist Edward Thorndike. So a little bit about Thorndike. He was born August 31st of 1874 in Williamsburg, Massachusetts. He later died on August 9th, 1949. He was known for reading psychology from a very young age. Just everything he could get his hands on in the psychological field, papers, books, anything he could read. And he was actually one of the first American psychologists to have all of his psychology education in the United States. First at Wesleyan University, then at Harvard University for a brief time, and then he finally completed his PhD in psychology at Columbia University in 1898. Thorndike's educational theory is that of connectionism, which is centered around stimulation and response variables. Whereas one force acts on the student reacts in its learning process. And this is an example of a behavioral psychology. And Thorndike divides up his idea of connectionism into three main laws: the law of effect, the law of readiness, and the law of exercise. In the law of effect, he described this as responses to a stimulus that are granted positive reinforcement will be strengthened by becoming habits. So, in a nutshell, a student reacts a certain way in their learning methods. The teacher reacts with a positive reinforcement. Thorndike says that those positive responses of the student will soon become students' habits. In the second law, the law of readiness, it describes how responses can be linked to achieve a goal and how students react in order to reach this higher level of thinking. And in the law of exercise, connections are strengthened through with practice, but weakened when associations are stopped. And this kind of goes into effect with the positive responses and positive reinforcement that's granted, how as students learn and develop through time, their connections that they make in their learning is strengthened with practice and reinforcement. But once this reinforcement stops, the student doesn't necessarily maintain that same level. They tend to start gradually weakening, gradually declining in their learnings. So a little bit more about connectionism. Students construct knowledge out of what is already in their minds. That's a quote from Mikichi, one of our authors. And that essentially says how students will remember and understand more or less depending on how they learn the information. If a student's playing an active part of their learning, they'll be more likely to understand the concept and being able to take ownership of the content. So Thorndike devoted much of his work to examining actually the behaviors and learning patterns of animals. He initially started off with children, but his research in psychology kind of took him away from children and more so into the field of animals and how they react. Actually, fun fact, one of this was he locked an animal in a cage, placing a starving animal, placing food right outside the cage, and he kind of recorded how long it took the animal to get out of the cage, whether it be pushing a button, flipping a lever, doing a certain action. And his study showed that by doing this over and over and with differing variables, like how the animal gets out, but by having practice and positive reinforcements with the food, was able to kind of get it faster, to learn it, to really understand it. And he discovered using that animals that, by extensions, us as humans, as members of the animal family, learn and understand a concept by strengthening existing knowledge bases and connecting them to form a segue into a new concept that we're learning. So with this theory of connectionism, students develop skills and strategies for learning, and as opposed to just learning content through rote memorization, they're learning how to deal with the questions, how to critically think. What do we do with this information? How will it help us as individuals? And this theory connects kind of the new of the old, with the old connection that's based on the existing knowledge base of the student, and it segues into new information, building upon previous knowledge rather than just throwing a new concept blank at a student with no experience. And this theory influences classroom teachers, and that is it encourages teachers to utilize concepts and technologies relevant to the student and to connect them with the concept or content you're trying to teach and get across, so the students will better remember and better understand it, as they will be associated with something they already have familiarity with. And a good example of this is using a current movie relative to students to encourage them to use higher order thinking skills to possibly connect a movie that you selected to a prescribed event in history, keeping in mind its social and historical context. Another good example would be if you're doing a lesson on the American Revolution. You see that your students utilize Facebook a lot in class when they're not necessarily supposed to. A good idea might be to have each student in the classroom pick an individual who was prominent in the American Revolution and maybe make a Facebook page about them. Create a profile about the historic individual, for example, Benjamin Franklin, with information, a short biography maybe, their major accomplishments in life, in the Revolution, who their friends would be, who their allies are, would probably be on their friends list, what stuff they would like if they had Facebook at the time, what organizations would they be a part of, what groups would they have on Facebook. And two key takeaways from this research are that new behaviors will slowly arise over time as the student wants to learn, and attempts at learning will increase success with each passing attempt. In other words, as students try and learn, they'll be able to use that older knowledge base to build off and expand their horizons with new ideas. And with this, students will learn from forming connections. We as educators should strive to utilize our students' prior knowledge and interests to best instill new concepts and deeper understanding.